Breer, senior NFL analyst correspondent from Monday Morning Quarterback. Albert, I greatly appreciate you coming on the show, my friend. How are you doing tonight?
I'm good. How you doing, Blake?
I'm doing well. Look, a little birdie, as I just mentioned, told me that you're a huge Ohio State fan. So I got to start off here. Justin Fields was just in my opinion, my second best quarterback in this past draft. But he falls to the Chicago Bears. Why do you think in this process Justin Fields fell? And great for Chicago, but why do you think he fell so far, in your opinion?
You know what the weird thing is, Blake, is like the two quarterbacks who've been torn apart the most, the 5 first-rounders, are the two guys who are the last ones standing at the end, and Mac Jones and Justin Fields. I mean, they got ripped to shreds, both of them. Right. And, you know, I think that it's not like Justin Fields' game is flawless, but, you know, like I'd say early in the process, a couple of team people sort of compared him to Justin Herbert. And I thought this was an interesting comparison and just kind of the way they set the whole thing up. And it was Justin Herbert was on such a big stage for so long, and we knew about him for so long, and we had kind of pegged him as a top 5 pick for so long that there's just like, what else good could you say about him? And so what do you do then? You start picking him apart. And I think even teams are guilty of this where, you know, when you've been watching a guy for so long and he's been on your radar for so long, you start to nitpick him. Now let's compare like Justin Fields then or Trevor Lawrence to Zach Wilson. I mean, I think there are a lot of people in America who didn't know who Zach Wilson was in November. Right. You know what I mean? Like, and I'm not even talking about like casual fans, like people who followed the NFL closely. And of course, team people knew who he was, but people who followed the NFL closely didn't know who he was. And so, you know, I do think to some degree with Justin Fields, there was a little bit of the same thing that went on with Justin Herbert, which was you're missing the forest for the trees. And you're like looking at little things and missing the big picture. And sure as hell happened with Justin Herbert. You know, I was guilty of it. You know, there were certain things about his game where I was like, oh, well, you know, there's this and this and this, and I'd be really careful about taking him. And, you know, the reality of it with Justin Fields is, what are we talking about? We're talking about 6 bad quarters, the second half against Indiana and the game against Northwestern, and they won both those games.
Right.
So, you know what I mean? Like, it's just, I do feel like he was sort of and look, like we did that with Trevor too. People forget this now, but like Trevor slumped during his sophomore year and people started picking at him. And if I remember right, Dabo got really upset with the media because they were like, he was like, what are you guys watching? And it's just, I think with certain guys, it just gets to the point where, you know, you've had them on this pedestal for so long that the only thing there is left to do is tear them down.
Well, I think you're so right, especially on Trevor Lawrence. I mean, look, we're in the base in Louisiana, so right, LSU's a big deal here. And after that national championship game and comparing him to Joe Burrow, he goes below 50%, and they're just ripping him to shreds. And I'm like, look, if you go back and watch that game from start to finish, yes, he goes below 50%. But he doesn't have time to throw the ball. He has 5 drops in the first half. I mean, there was just a lot of things that were going on for Trevor Lawrence, and I agree with you. We're really just nitpicking about the small things, but I think Chicago gets a really good guy in Justin Fields. You mentioned Zach Wilson and the Jets. I don't like comparing or really giving grades for drafts. I think it's kind of, you know, like we haven't really seen these guys play. But it felt like, Albert, when I was watching the Jets draft, it was like I was screaming for them to do all of that when Sam Darnold was there. And then all of a sudden, it's just like they do it for Zach Wilson. Are you surprised, number one, that they do it? And do they have kind of a sneaky are they like the sneaky best draft?
I really like their draft. And I like what I like about it more than anything, Blake, is there's almost like a self-awareness to it. And that we understand where we screwed it up with Sam Darnold. And I think if you talk to enough people there, what you'll find is they're willing to take culpability for it. Like, we screwed this up. Like, we don't know what Sam Darnold is after 3 years. And I've talked to people who really know what they're talking about, who say, I can't tell what I'm looking at with Sam Darnold right now because the situation was so broken around him. Went through a coaching change after year 1. I think, you know, him and Adam Gase, for better or worse, it was a mismatch of coach to player. And then they just didn't put anything around him, you know? And so to me, like that's what I liked so much about the Jets draft is there was a self-awareness to it. It was, we are not going to let happen to Zach Wilson what happened to Sam Darnold. We're going to do everything in our power not to let that happen again. And to get Oliveira Tucker, you pair him with Mekhi Becton. Now, I mean, you may wind up with 2 all-pro linemen to anchor your group up front to protect him. You bring in Elijah Moore, who a lot of teams felt like was a first-round pick and is an A-plus kid. Based on conversations with every team in the league, like everybody loved him. And so there's your guy, your slot receiver to create easy completions. And then you pick up Michael Carter in the 4th round who can catch the ball out of the backfield. And so you're just making things easier on your quarterback. And I just, I'm a big believer. There are very few quarterbacks who can overcome their circumstances. And I think that's what's sort of unique about the Trevor class, like what Trevor, the echelon that Trevor is on, the tier that he's on, historically, like John Elway, Peyton Manning, Andrew Luck, Trevor Lawrence, like, okay, like maybe there are 4 guys in my lifetime that it almost like wouldn't matter. You can put them in a lot of different situations and they'd succeed. The rest of them pretty much are, what's his circumstances? Who's coaching him? Who are his teammates? And if you screw it up in the first 4 or 5 years for a guy, you might ruin him forever. And so that's what I really like about the Jets and their draft is there was a real focus there on making sure that the situation they're dropping their young quarterback into is conducive to him not having the weight of the world on his shoulders right away.
Speaking of Sam Darnold, look, Joe Brady is a guy that I met multiple times just covering the team and being around here. And a guy he always talked about, now he doesn't coach quarterbacks, but he always talked about quarterback play and short, quick releases to get in rhythm and then going down the field. He did it with Joe Burrow a lot. Is Sam Darnold going to be beneficial because of Joe Brady in this system? And do we really know what we have with Sam Darnold? Because like you mentioned, he was so bad and so toxic with the Jets. Could we see a meteoric rise from Sam Darnold now that he's in Carolina?
It's going to be interesting to watch. Like I mentioned how the fit wasn't great between Sam and the Jets and Adam Gase. And I think a big piece of that was like, I think people look at USC quarterbacks and because they'd been pro style for so long, think like these guys come in ready made. That's not what Sam Darnold came from. He was a multi-sport athlete in high school, not a classically trained quarterback. He's a linebacker his sophomore year,
Right.
And then he gets to USC, and really, the offense that Clay Helton's running, it's not a pro style offense. It was very simplistic and very just like based on tempo and. So he wasn't like he was asked to go out there and be an athlete. Then he gets to the pros. Year 1 goes okay. Coaching staff gets fired. And then, Gase comes in and Gase's offense was built for Peyton Manning. And there was even a point there where, the front office went to the coaches and said, can you take the line calls off of him and give them to the center? Like, seriously, it's like we're overloading him. We're asking him to do too much right now. And so, I think the fact that Sam's going to go to a coordinator who I think is going to try to get him playing fast again is the most beneficial part of it. The other thing is the teammates he's got.
Well, and I can tell you, go ahead. I'm sorry.
The whole idea of them signing Le'Veon Bell, and it didn't work, but the idea of them signing Le'Veon Bell in 2019 was let's give him, what Todd Gurley was for Jared Goff. Let's give him what Ezekiel Elliott was for Dak Prescott. And Sam will have that in Carolina. Christian McCaffrey's still there. I mean, so long as he comes back off the injury okay, you're going to have a guy that's going to be kind of the nerve center of the offense, and that's going to allow Sam Darnold to just go out and play a little bit more.
So I do got to ask you some Louisiana questions because the questions are firing into this comments. Okay, I'm going to get there. When we look just around the NFL, it seemed as if that this entire draft was a smaller draft class for whatever reason. Maybe kids just coming back to school. Like, for example, LSU had an entire offense and defensive line returning. Do you foresee this next upcoming class with so many kids going into the NFL, it just being absolutely loaded with talent?
It should be. I mean, I think on paper you say it would be, although I don't know. I mean, how many kids are there that could have gone and been high draft picks this year, didn't go? Not that many, right? Like last year, I know Bama had a bunch back, like Devontae Smith and Alex Leatherwood. Ohio State had a few back. Like, Sean Wade could have gone. He went back to school. I'm just trying to think. Like, there aren't a lot like of guys that where you say, okay, that guy could have gone pro and he didn't. So I don't know the top of the draft is going to be that much better. Like you have I think you have a small group of players at the top, and I know people down there are obviously really familiar with Derek Stingley. I think he'll be somebody who's going to be in the upper reaches of the first round. Kayvon Thibodeau at Oregon, like Evan Neal, who I'd expect is going to move over to left tackle at Alabama. Like there are a few guys like where you can say, okay, that's the super group. But I don't think that the top of the draft is going to be any more loaded than this year. Where I think you're going to see it is in depth. And that's why so many teams were so willing to move late round picks this year, because I think because there weren't as many guys in the class in general. I think the way teams looked at it is those like 5th, 6th, 7th round picks, I mean, really weren't that much different than what they were going to be able to get in with the undrafted free agents, right? So if I can move this pick because this team's coming up, like I might as well just do it, like because I'm going to be able to make up for it with the undrafted free agents. So, maybe it swings back around next year and you have more depth. So I would say the difference would probably be like you'll just have a deeper class next year, but it won't necessarily be that much better at the top because I do think most of the guys who had the opportunity to go pro that were like at that level, I think most of them went just because of everything that all the college kids had to go through this year just to get the season played.
Yeah, I mean, 3 COVID tests a week and not being paid, that's got to be detriment in and of itself. All right, we have some questions firing in about the Saints. So this one I'm not going to do, Albert. I'm not going to rip the Pink Warner draft in the second round. I'm not going to do it. It's a need. They went and got a guy from Ohio State, Sean Payton. I don't know what it is. I think that he just says, hey, screw it. We're just going to draft somebody from Ohio State, and they plug somebody. But do you think, because – the Peyton Turner DN from Houston pick, just to me, I understand the pick. I really do. I don't understand the player so much. I know that he had a kind of a rise there at the end, but there were so many needs that they needed. A corner. I get that there was corners that came off the board early, but why him at there? It bumfuzzles me.
I'll say this. Like I do think, the Saints. They don't really go on people's valuations to begin with, and they have reason to believe in what they do. I mean, I think last year's draft, when obviously it takes Cesar Ruiz where they took him, but to move up so aggressively for Zach Bond and to move up aggressively for Troutman, and like what they did, I think like last year to me was such a great window into the way that they operate, and that we know exactly what we want. And like, we don't care what it costs to go and get them. We're not building margin for error because we think we're right. You know what I mean? Like where other teams build margin for error because everybody gets them wrong. And I do think like the one thing that's sort of interesting about Peyton Turner, and I'll be honest with you, like I was surprised to see him go in the first round.
Me too.
I think it's that position this year though. Like that's what that was. Those edge positions this year, like you didn't have. First of all, there wasn't like a Chase Young or a Jadeveon Clowney or and why am I blanking? Myles Garrett at the top of the draft. There wasn't one of those guys. And even past that, there weren't. It was more like, okay, this guy's an athletic freak. Let's see what he can do. So that was Jason Owe. That was Jalen Phillips. That was Greg Rousseau. That was to some degree Kwity Paye, who's a little more developed. That was Azeez Ojulari, who's a little more developed, but still has some rawness to him. And so I think that was sort of the nature of those edge positions this year was like, all right, like this guy has the physical profile of what we would look for in the position, but the production isn't quite there yet, so we're projecting. So I can see where the Saints would say, we have him with these other guys anyway, and we're probably not going to get him at our next pick. So let's just bite the bullet, take him here, because we believe that he's as good as, again, like a Jalen Phillips or a Kwity Paye or a Greg Rousseau or a Jason Owe.
Yeah, and I honestly thought that they would go Elijah Moore, Kadarius Toney at that 28 slot if they stayed there, or maybe even a Terrace Marshall. Because look, when Mike Thomas went down, you didn't have a lot of weapons outside of Alvin Kamara. That's why I was just wondering. It was a head scratcher. Now, two more questions. I'll get you out of here. A lot of people are wondering about Drew Brees now that Jameis Winston is going to be in here, and I'm not going to bore you by reading all this from Brian Viator. It's just a novel. But basically, from an a Saints level, we kind of now look at it as, well, the Saints have done this multiple times, with whether it be with Teddy Bridgewater, Taysom Hill, even one game with Jameis Winston. Regardless of Drew being there, they've won. So now that Jameis is going to be probably the full-time starter, do you think that it's going to bode well for the Saints, or are we going to see the Saints in the top of the draft next year doing everything they can to get one of these quarterbacks?
I mean, I don't think they'll be at the top of the draft because I don't think they're going to be that bad. So I mean, and look, like they made a play at a huge move up this year, and I know Sean said it the other day. That was my understanding before the draft too, that it was J.C. Horn 1, Patrick Surtain 2, and that they talked to every team between 4 and 15 about a move up. So they're not afraid to do that sort of thing. Now, I mean, they didn't make the move up because they weren't willing to put a third first-round pick on the table. So that was sort of that. But I think they've shown the willingness to make aggressive moves if they need to fill the position. I talked to Sean about this a few weeks ago, and I really do think, like, he thinks both these guys have a chance. And whether it works or not, we'll see. But I think he's got every reason to believe that, like, he can get more out of a quarterback than the average coach can. Right. And it's real easy to forget now, after everything that Drew Brees has accomplished, where he was when they picked him up off the scrap heap. I mean, the Chargers had given up on him like 3 separate times. I mean, it wasn't just after the shoulder injury. They'd benched him before for Doug Flutie in like 2002, I believe. They drafted Phillip Rivers while he was still on the roster. And Drew showed a lot of fight, through all of that. But I don't know that anybody thought, like, Drew was going to become what he became.
Right.
And, like, Jameis's history isn't super different than that. But, like, the one thing that gives me pause about Jameis is the propensity for turning the ball over. Goes all the way back to Florida State. And that's the one thing I wonder, can you coach that out of a guy? Because a lot of people think, a lot of coaches and scouts believe that you either do or you don't. So that's going to be the interesting part to me, like whether or not they can manage that. I mean, like, look, like if anybody can get it out of Jameis, I think it's Sean. He's got a good team around him. I mean, it's not like this is broken. He's going to be throwing to Alvin Kamara and Michael Thomas. He's got one of the best lines in football in front of him. And the defense still has a boatload of talent despite some of the guys they lost. So, the way I look at it is they've created a really good situation to drop a young quarterback into. And at worst, I think because of the ability Sean Payton has to coach, maybe Jameis Winston or Taysom Hill can be your equivalent to what Alex Smith was in Kansas City for Andy Reid, where he buys you time until you find somebody out there that you really think is worth selling out to go up and get.
And look, what's even crazier about Jameis is a laser eye. I forget what it's called. Laser. Yeah. I mean, like not even knowing that for 5 years or 4 years at Tampa and then has it here. I mean, that was a crazy story to me. All right, one more. I really appreciate you joining us. Albert Breer, senior NFL analyst, joins us. Jamar Chase. Okay, it was a big debate. I felt like, was he going to go 5? Was the Bengals going to take Penei Sewell? Look, as a former collegiate offensive lineman, and I got ripped for this being an LSU guy. Okay, I thought they should go O-line, but I like the Jamar Chase pick. I think Jamar Chase, I've seen him up close. I mean, it's a great pick. Were you shocked when they went wide receiver versus O-line there?
No, I actually expected it. And I do think for the Bengals, like a big part of it was looking at the first two days of the draft as like a mosaic. And it was, how can we get a special player at the top, like a difference maker at the top, and still take care of all of our needs within the first couple of rounds? So what that boiled down to was, are we better off taking Penei Sewell at 5 and then rolling back in the second or third round and getting a receiver somewhere there, or the other way around, taking Chase at 5 and coming back around and taking a receiver in the second or third round? I think the way that they viewed it, they thought that Jamar Chase was, I mean, like I said, like if you could rank the top 5 receiver prospects of the last 10 years, it's not quite Kyle Pitts, because Kyle Pitts would be number 1 of the last 10 years at his position.
Right.
But so if you list the top 5 at his position over the last 10 years, Jamar Chase would probably be on the list. On top of that, I mean, Joe really put in a good recommendation for him. And you can call it what you want, stumping for him, recommending him, whatever you want to call it. Joe Burrow really helped Jamar Chase in this process. And one of the things that really stuck out, I know he said this to Zach Taylor and Brian Callahan and the coaching staff there. He said, whenever I went to do something extra, Jamar Chase was there doing something extra with me.
He was.
And that was a huge thing when you were talking about one kid in Chase versus another in Penei Sewell who had some immaturity questions, who, you know, maybe wasn't quite the offensive line prospect that Chase was the receiver prospect. And on top of that, the Bengals also sent their offensive line coach, Frank Pollock, out to a ton of the pro days for the second and third round offensive linemen. I mean, to the point where like other teams noticed it and picked up on it. And so, you know, I think that they view it as like we wanted to get Joe as much help in front of him as we could, but at the same time, we wanted to make sure that we got like somebody that we felt like was a true difference maker at 5. And they felt like Chase had a better chance to be a true difference maker at 5 than Sewell would have. And they felt comfortable with what they had come away with on day 2. And they wind up with Jackson Carman, who's going to play guard for them, who's left tackle at Clemson, 2-year starter in front of Trevor Lawrence. And you throw him in with the group now. You got Jonah Williams from Alabama a couple of years ago, former top 10 pick. Riley Reef, who they picked up from Minnesota. And so I think it was just more than anything else. It was like, it wasn't looking at one player versus the other strictly, though that was part of it. It was also looking at how are we going to come away from the draft in general with the strongest situation to put Joe Burrow in.
Well, I'm just going to throw this out there. I mean, Joe was doing some secret things behind the scenes to the coon asses of Louisiana, saying go to Twitter and say Jamar Chase to the Bengals. So they were going crazy. I don't know. I'm not saying it helped, but it always will. You never know. You never know. Albert, you being fantastic, man, as always. I greatly appreciate you joining the show. Everybody knows who you are and where you're at, but just in case, tell everybody where they can find all the stuff and all the great stuff that you guys are doing.
Yeah, we're obviously at the MMQB.com, SI.com. We got a lot of great NFL content up there year-round, so be sure to check us out, subscribe. You can check out my podcast, The Albert Breer Show, and if you want to get to me on social, at Albert Breer on Twitter, at Albert R. Breer on Facebook, and at Albert_Breer on Instagram.
Well, I greatly appreciate it, and I promise you the next time you come on, we'll talk some Ohio State. How about